The wind screamed like a banshee, tearing shingles from Liam's roof, the rain a relentless, horizontal barrage that turned his backyard into a churning, gray-brown lake. One moment, Willow, his elusive silver-gray semi-feral queen, was a tense shadow huddled under the dubious shelter of the sagging porch swing, her green eyes wide with primal fear. The next, a monstrous gust ripped through, the swing itself wrenching violently from its chains with a shriek of tortured metal. Liam, pressed against the shuddering kitchen window, his heart a frantic bird in his chest, saw only a blur of gray fur swallowed whole by the howling maelstrom before the porch light flickered and died, plunging everything into chaotic darkness. "Willow!" His raw cry was instantly devoured by the storm's fury. She was gone, vanished into the elemental nightmare. Again. Liam slammed his palm against the cold glass, a wave of sickening dread washing over him, colder than the rain lashing the panes. This wasn't the first storm Willow had faced, nor the first time. She'd seemingly vanished into its maw. She wasn't truly his cat, not in the way a purring lap cat was owned. Willow was a creature of the wild edges appearing 2 years ago, a silent, watchful ghost at the periphery of his life. Thin, wary, bearing the faint scars of a harsh existence. Liam, living alone in the old, slightly ramshackle farmhouse at the edge of town, had simply started leaving food. Dry kibble on the porch steps, sometimes a bowl of water. Months of patient nonchalance, reading on the porch while she watched from the hydrangeas, talking softly to the empty air, had earned him cautious proximity. She'd slink closer, eat, while he sat perfectly still, occasionally allowing a flicker of curiosity in those ancient-seeming green eyes. He'd named her for the way she moved, like a willow branch swaying in a gentle breeze. Fluid, silent, always poised to retreat. He'd even managed to gently place a breakaway collar on her during a rare moment of trust, a small bell and his phone number etched onto a tag, a fragile tether to this wild spirit he'd inexplicably come to care for deeply. Her disappearances during bad weather were agonizing rituals. He'd search, call, leave out extra food soaked in tuna juice, his anxiety a physical knot in his gut until, inevitably, she'd reappear. Sometimes days later, sometimes, like last time, perched impossibly on the steep, rain-slicked apex of his roof at dawn, gazing down with an unnerving calm, as if she'd merely stepped out for a stroll. But this storm, this felt different. Apocalyptic. And the porch swing, that felt like an omen. He couldn't wait. Logic screamed it was suicide, but the image of Willow, terrified, swept away, crushed. It overrode everything. Grabbing his heaviest waterproof jacket, a powerful flashlight already flickering ominously, and a thick towel, he plunged into the storm's teeth. The force of the wind nearly knocked him off the porch steps. Rain stung his face like icy needles, instantly soaking through his jeans. The beam of his flashlight cut a feeble, swinging cone through the murk, illuminating only driving rain and the violent thrashing of trees. "Willow! Here, girl! Willow!" His shouts were pathetic whispers against the gale. He scanned the drowned yard, the overturned trash cans, the skeletal remains of his tomato plants, the swollen creek bordering his property, now a roaring, chocolate-brown torrent threatening to breach its banks. No sign. Panic, cold and sharp, began to crystallize. Where would she go? Where could she go? The woods? They were being shredded. The old barn? Its roof groaned under the assault. Driven by a desperation that burned hotter than the chill soaking his bones, Liam fought his way towards the woods, the ground sucking greedily at his boots. The beam caught a flash of color caught on a low, whipping branch near the creek's edge, a tiny glint of metal. He lunged, slipping in the mud, grabbing the branch. Tangled in the twigs was a small, sodden strip of blue nylon, Willow's collar. The breakaway clasp had done its job, but the collar being here, so close to the raging creek, his breath hitched. Had she? He swept the light frantically across. The churning water, the beam trembling in his shaking hand. Nothing but debris, branches, leaves, a plastic bucket swirling past. The roaring water seemed to mock his helplessness. She couldn't swim in this. Nothing could. Suddenly, movement. Not in the water, but high above on the far bank, partially obscured by the lashing branches of a massive, half-uprooted oak. A flicker of silver gray, low to the ground, moving with purpose against the wind, heading deeper into the woods, away from his property, away from the perceived safety of the house. "Willow," Liam whispered, hope surging, sharp and painful. But why was she going further in? Into the teeth of the storm? It made no sense. He had to get to her. Crossing the creek was impossible here. The usual stepping stones were submerged, the current deadly. He'd have to go upstream to the rickety footbridge near Miller's Field. It added precious minutes, each one feeling like an eternity. The wind tore at him, branches cracked overhead like gunshots, the flashlight beam growing weaker, the battery symbol blinking a dire warning. Finally reaching the bridge, Liam's heart sank further. The creek had surged over its banks here too, the bridge submerged under a foot of fast-flowing, debris-filled water. The handrails vibrated under his grip. Crossing was madness. But the image of Willow, that flash of gray heading deeper into the dangerous woods, propelled him forward. He inched across, the water pulling fiercely at his legs, the wooden planks slick and treacherous underfoot. Halfway, a large branch slammed into the railing beside him with a sickening crack, showering him with icy spray. He gasped, clinging on, the flashlight dipping, momentarily plunging him into terrifying darkness before it flickered back, weaker still. He stumbled the last few steps onto the far bank, breathing hard, soaked to the skin and shivering violently. He was committed now. The woods swallowed him. The storm's fury amplified beneath the canopy, a cacophony of creaking timber, snapping branches, and the relentless drumming of rain on leaves. The beam, now a sickly yellow, barely pierced 10 feet. Every shadow writhed. Every sound was a potential threat. Where was she? Why come here? He pushed deeper, calling her name, his voice hoarse, almost lost. The ground was a treacherous swamp of mud and hidden roots. Brambles snatched at his jacket. He scanned desperately, the weak light catching only glimpses. The frantic scuttle of a possum, the glint of water on a spiderweb, the skeletal silhouette of a dead tree swaying precariously. Then a sound that wasn't the storm. Faint, high-pitched, desperate, a mewling, not Willow's low, cautious chirp. This was the terrified cry of something very young, very small. Liam froze, listening. It came again, a thin, piercing sound of pure distress, cutting through the wind's roar. It seemed to come from a dense thicket of blackberry brambles and fallen logs ahead and slightly to the left. Was Willow hurt? Trapped? The cry sounded again, weaker this time. Liam shoved forward, ignoring the thorns tearing at his hands. His focus narrowed to that pitiful sound. He reached the thicket, dropping to his knees, shining the dying flashlight beam into the tangled darkness beneath the fallen logs. And there she was, Willow. Crouched low, her fur plastered dark with mud and rain, but her posture wasn't cowering. It was protective, tense, guarding. Her green eyes, reflecting the feeble light, locked onto his for a split second. Not with fear, but with an intensity that stopped his breath. A fierce, almost unnatural focus. Then her gaze flicked down, and Liam followed it. Tucked deep in a muddy hollow beneath the largest log, shivering violently, eyes screwed shut, emitting those thin, desperate cries, was a tiny ball of soaked ginger fur. A kitten, no bigger than his fist. Abandoned, orphaned, lost in the storm. How had Willow found it? Why was she here guarding it instead of seeking her own shelter? The questions exploded in Liam's mind, momentarily eclipsing his relief at finding her alive. He reached a slow, cautious hand towards the hollow. "Easy, Willow. Easy, girl." "It's okay." Willow didn't hiss, didn't retreat. She watched his hand, her body still taut as a wire. As his fingers neared the shivering kitten, she gave a low, urgent murmur, not a growl, but a sound of profound communication, her eyes never leaving his face. She nudged the tiny ginger form gently with her nose, then looked back at Liam, that intense, almost pleading look in her eyes. "Help!" It seemed to scream across the storm's chaos. "Help this one!" Liam's heart clenched. He carefully scooped the tiny, ice-cold kitten into the towel he'd brought for Willow, bundling it gently. It felt like a feather, barely moving, its cries reduced to faint, shuddering gasps. Hypothermia. It needed warmth now. He looked back at Willow, expecting her to follow now that the kitten was safe. "Come on, girl. Let's go home, both of you." He patted his chest, urging her. But Willow didn't move from her protective crouch by the hollow. Instead, she tilted her head, listening intently to something beyond the thicket, beyond the roar of the wind and rain. Her ears flattened. Her hackles, barely visible under the soaked fur, rose. A low, guttural growl, unlike any sound Liam had ever heard her make, rumbled in her chest. It was a sound of pure, predatory warning. Liam froze, the bundled kitten fragile weight against his pounding heart. He strained his ears, trying to hear what Willow heard. Beyond the thrashing branches and the rain's drumming, was that something else? A heavy padding step? A deep, guttural sniffing? His weakening flashlight beam wavered as he slowly turned his head, following Willow's fixed, terrified gaze out into the deeper blackness of the storm-lashed woods. The beam caught it for a fraction of a second, a pair of eyes, low to the ground, reflecting the light with a cold, greenish-yellow gleam, much larger than a possum, much closer than he'd thought. Watching. The beam flickered again, plunging the thicket into near darkness, then sputtered back, weaker, casting long, dancing, monstrous shadows. The eyes were gone, but the sense of being hunted, of raw, ancient, danger lurking just beyond the circle of light, pressed in like the storm itself. Willow pressed herself lower, a terrified statue guarding an empty hollow, her growl now a silent vibration Liam could feel in his own bones. They were exposed, trapped in the thicket. The kitten was dying in his hands, and something out there in the black, rain-drenched woods wanted them. Liam's mind raced, icy fingers of fear closing around his throat. The flashlight was dying. The creek was a raging barrier behind them. The house was too far. He had a helpless kitten, slowly freezing against his chest. Willow was frozen in terror, and whatever had those eyes, it was between them and any hope of safety. The storm raged on, indifferent. The feeble light caught the glint of rain on Willow's fur as she stared, unblinking, into the impenetrable dark, a silent sentinel against, an unseen, unimaginable threat. Escape seemed impossible. The roar of the creek behind them merged with the howling wind and the frantic hammering of Liam's own heart, a symphony of doom. He pulled the shivering kitten closer, his arms tightening. Protectively around the tiny bundle, his eyes locked on the spot where the predator's eyes had gleamed. The darkness felt alive, breathing, waiting. He had no weapon, no plan. Only the dying light, the storm, the terrified cat, the fading kitten, and the crushing certainty that they were not alone. The unseen hunter took another step. The sound of a heavy paw squelching in the mud, terrifyingly close, just beyond the thicket's edge. Liam held his breath. Willow's growl died in her throat, replaced by a sound of pure, primal dread. The darkness moved. The darkness lunged. Not a shadow, but a solid, snarling mass of wet fur and muscle exploding from the undergrowth. Yellowed fangs flashed in the flashlight's dying sputter. Coyote. Lean, desperate from the storm, driven by hunger into territory it usually avoided. It slammed against the outer wall of brambles, snapping viciously at the tangled branches mere feet from where Liam knelt, the terrified kitten a frozen lump against his chest. Willow didn't flee. With a hiss that shredded the air, she launched herself towards the threat, a small, sodden bolt of gray fury, not to attack, but to deflect. She raked lightning-fast claws across the coyote's muzzle as it recoiled momentarily from the thorns. "Willow, no!" Liam's shout was raw terror. The coyote, enraged and startled by the unexpected assault from such a small creature, whipped its head around, snapping at empty air as Willow darted back into the thicker brambles near Liam's legs. The flashlight beam guttered wildly in his shaking hand, casting monstrous leaping shadows. The coyote recovered instantly, its focus shifting entirely to the easier prey trapped in the thicket. Liam and the bundle he held. It lowered its head, a guttural growl vibrating deep in its chest, gathering itself to push through the thorny barrier. Liam scrambled backwards, thorns tearing his jacket, his boots slipping in the mud. He had seconds. The dying flashlight, it was all he had. With a desperate prayer, he hurled the heavy flashlight like a club, straight at the coyote's head. It wasn't a clean hit, but the sudden movement and the clunk of plastic against bone made the predator flinch, snarling in surprise and pain. It stumbled back a pace, shaking its head. The beam, miraculously still flickering, rolled away, illuminating the churning creek water visible through a gap in the trees behind the thicket. The creek. The roaring barrier was now their only possible escape route. It was madness. Hypothermia. Drowning, being swept away, but staying meant being torn apart. "Willow, to the water, now!" Liam roared, surging to his feet, clutching the kitten tightly inside his jacket now, using the towel to shield it as best he could. He didn't wait to see if she followed. He turned and plunged through the gap towards the creek bank, the coyotes, furious snarls erupting behind him as it realized its prey was bolting. He heard the frantic scramble through the brambles close behind him. Willow. The bank was steep, slick mud. The creek was a raging beast, wider than before, carrying whole, branches like battering rams. There was no time for thought, only instinct. He aimed for a spot downstream where the current seemed to swirl slightly, maybe offering a fraction less violence. "Hold on, little one," he gasped to the kitten, tucking it impossibly tighter. He took one running step and launched himself into the freezing chaos. The shock of the water stole his breath. The current seized him instantly, yanking him downstream, pulling him under. Muddy water filled his mouth and nose. He kicked wildly, fighting for the surface, one arm wrapped fiercely around the precious bundle inside his jacket. His head broke the surface, gasping, choking. He was moving terrifyingly fast, spinning. Where was Willow? Panic surged anew. He twisted, scanning the churning surface, catching glimpses of debris, foam, darkness. Then, a small gray head broke. The water 10 feet downstream, gasping, eyes wide with terror, paddling frantically but losing ground against the torrent. She was being swept towards a deadly snag of submerged trees. "No! Willow!" He kicked harder, trying to angle towards her, the current fighting him every inch. He was a strong swimmer, but the freezing water was sapping his strength, the weight of his soaked clothes dragging him down. He saw her go under, swept behind a large, half-submerged log. She didn't surface. "Willow!" The cry was ripped from him, raw with despair. He fought the current, clawing his way towards the log, the kitten a faint, cold pulse against his skin. Reaching the log, he grabbed a slippery branch, hauling himself partly out of the main current, gasping, scanning the frothing water downstream. Nothing, only the relentless, roaring brown rush. Grief, cold and absolute, washed over him. He'd lost her. After everything, He'd lost her saving the kitten. Then, movement. On the other side of the log, in the slightly calmer eddy formed by its bulk, a sodden gray shape struggled weakly, trying to claw its way onto a submerged root. Willow! She'd been pushed under the log and surfaced in the lee. She was exhausted, barely keeping her head above water, her movements feeble. "Hang on, girl! Hang on!" Liam shouted, hope flaring. Painfully, he had to get to her. He pushed off the log, letting the current carry him the few feet into the eddy. The water was still chest deep, but the pull was less violent. He reached her just as her strength gave out. Her head slipped below the surface. He lunged, grabbing, the scruff of her neck hauling her up. She coughed, water streaming from her nose, her body limp with cold and exhaustion. He tucked her inside his jacket with the kitten, holding both shivering creatures against his own rapidly cooling body. "I've got you," he choked, tears mixing with the rain and creek water on his face. "I've got you both." The other side of the creek was closer now, but steep and slick. He had to get out. Now. He kicked towards the bank, using the log for, leverage. His muscles screamed, his lungs burned. He grabbed at roots, at clumps of grass, his numb fingers slipping. Finally, his boot found purchase on a submerged rock. He heaved, scrambling, crawling up the muddy bank, collapsing onto solid ground, gasping, retching creek water. Willow and the kitten were still bundles inside his jacket, terrifyingly still and cold. He was miles from home, soaked, freezing, lost in the storm-lashed woods on the wrong side of the creek with two barely alive cats. But they were alive. For now. He forced himself up. Shelter. Warmth. He stumbled through the woods, directionless, disoriented. The storm seemed to be lessening slightly, the wind dropping from a shriek to a moan, the rain no longer horizontal. He followed the creek downstream, hoping it would lead him back towards familiar territory. He walked for what felt like hours, his body shaking violently with cold, his mind a fog of exhaustion and fear. He kept checking the bundle inside his jacket. The kitten was so still. Willow stirred occasionally, a faint tremor running through her. He talked to them constantly, his voice a raspy whisper against the wind. "Stay with me, please. Just stay with me." Finally, through the thinning trees, he saw a light. A single, blessed porch light. It wasn't his house. It was the old Henderson place, abandoned for years, but someone must have moved in. Hope, fragile but fierce, ignited. He stumbled towards it, tripping over roots, his vision blurring. He reached the porch, collapsing against the door, hammering weakly with his free hand. "Help! Please! Help!" The door opened. Mrs. Henderson, a kind-faced woman in her 70s Liam vaguely recognized from town, gasped, "Good heavens, come in, come in!" She pulled him inside the warm, dry hallway. He collapsed to his knees, unable to stand. "Cats. Freezing. Need warmth." He managed to croak, carefully pulling open his jacket. The tiny ginger kitten lay like a wet, lifeless rag. Willow, barely conscious, lay curled around it, her fur plastered to her bony frame, her breath shallow. Mrs. Henderson didn't hesitate. "Oh, you poor darlings, here, quickly!" She guided him to her plush sofa, bustling away to return moments. Later, with thick towels warmed in the dryer, a heating pad, and a small eyedropper. She took the kitten first, wrapping it gently in a warm towel, rubbing it softly, then began administering tiny drops of warm water mixed with a little honey from the eyedropper onto its gums. "Come on, little one. Come on," she murmured. Liam focused on Willow, rubbing her vigorously with a warm towel, feeling her thin body tremble violently as circulation slowly returned. He looked into her half-lidded eyes. "You did it, girl," he whispered, his voice thick. "You saved him. You found him. You brave, brave girl." Willow blinked slowly, a faint rumble starting deep in her chest. Not a purr, but a sound of utter exhaustion and relief. Her gaze drifted towards the kitten, a look of profound, weary concern in her green eyes. Minutes crawled by, filled only by the crackle of Mrs. Henderson's fireplace and her soft murmurs to the kitten. Liam kept rubbing Willow, feeling her. Shivering gradually subside, her breathing deepen. Then, a miracle. A tiny, weak sneeze came from the bundle in Mrs. Henderson's hands. Then another. The kitten stirred feebly, its mouth opening in a silent cry. "That's it, sweetheart, that's it," Mrs. Henderson cooed, offering another drop of warm honey water. This time, a tiny pink tongue flicked out. It swallowed. Liam's breath hitched. He looked down at Willow. Her eyes were fully open now, fixed intently on the kitten. That intense, focused look was back, softened now by profound relief. It took hours of gentle warming, tiny feedings of special kitten formula Mrs. Henderson miraculously had, an old hand at rescues, she explained, and quiet vigilance. Willow refused to leave the kitten's side once she was warm enough to move. She curled protectively around the tiny ginger form on a nest of towels near the fire, cleaning its fur with rough, tender licks, watching Liam and Mrs. Henderson with wary but grateful eyes. When the kitten, finally warmed and fed, let out a feeble rumbling purr against Willow's side, Liam saw something shift in the semi-feral cat's expression. A tension he hadn't even realized was always there seemed to melt away. She rested, her chin gently on the tiny body, and closed her eyes, a deep, shuddering sigh escaping her. Liam reached out slowly, cautiously, and placed his hand on her damp head, not stroking, just resting it there. Willow didn't flinch. She leaned ever so slightly into the touch. A bond, forged in the heart of a storm and the shadow of death, solidified in the quiet warmth of a stranger's kindness. The storm finally passed as dawn painted the sky bruised purple and gold. Liam, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, sat on Mrs. Henderson's sofa, Willow asleep beside him, one paw possessively draped over the now sleeping kitten nestled against her belly. The vet had come and gone, pronouncing both cats miraculously okay, just exhausted and needing warmth, food, and rest. The kitten, a male, was about 4 weeks old, likely abandoned or lost. "This one," the vet had said, nodding at Willow with professional awe, "is a fighter and a guardian angel." Mrs. Henderson insisted they stay until they were fully recovered, pressing warm tea and toast on Liam. As the first true rays of sunlight streamed through the window, warming the room, Liam looked down at the unlikely pair. The fierce, wild spirit who had chosen the edges of his life and the tiny, helpless scrap of ginger fur she had defied a hurricane and a predator to protect. He thought of the collar by the creek, her inexplicable journey into the woods, her fierce defense, her silent plea. This wasn't just survival. This was something deeper, something profoundly compassionate and mysterious. He gently scooped up the sleeping bundle, both cats, Willow stirring only to resettle against him, her head resting trustingly on his arm, the kitten a warm, purring weight on his chest. Mrs. Henderson smiled, tears in her eyes. "You've got your hands full now, love," she whispered, handing him a carrier lined with warm towels. Walking back to his battered farmhouse in the calm, washed-clean morning air, the rising sun glinting off puddles, Liam felt a profound peace settle over him, deeper than the exhaustion. He looked down at the carrier. Willow's green eyes watched him through the mesh, calm, knowing. The kitten slept on, oblivious. He pushed open his front door. Home. He carefully lifted Willow out first, setting her down gently on the familiar rug. She stretched, shook herself, then turned immediately back to the carrier, emitting a soft, questioning chirp. Liam lifted the tiny ginger kitten out. Willow approached, sniffed him thoroughly, then began meticulously grooming his still damp fur, purring a deep, resonant rumble that filled the quiet room. The kitten woke, blinked sleepy blue eyes, and nuzzled against her, his tiny purr joining hers in a fragile, perfect harmony. Liam sank into his old armchair, watching them. The semi-feral ghost of the storm had vanished. In her place stood a mother, a guardian, her mysterious mission finally clear. She had braved the apocalypse not just to survive, but to bring this tiny life out of the darkness and into the light, into his light. She led the wobbling kitten towards the food bowl. He'd hastily filled, nudging him gently towards the kibble. Then she turned and walked towards Liam. She didn't jump onto his lap. She never had. Instead, she sat primly at his feet, looking up at him, not with wariness, but with a quiet, steady gaze that held centuries of wild wisdom, and now something new, belonging. She gave a soft, deliberate blink. Liam blinked slowly back, a silent promise passing between them. He reached down, not to grab, but to offer his fingers. Willow leaned forward, bumping her head against his knuckles, a brief, powerful connection. Then she turned back to the kitten, who was attempting to climb into the food bowl. Liam leaned back, the warmth of the rising sun finally reaching his chair, the soft sounds of contented cats filling the silence left by the storm. The roof outside the window was empty. The porch swing was gone. But inside, his quiet, ramshackle house felt fuller than it ever had. He hadn't just found his cat after the storm. He'd found her heart, fierce and vast enough to rescue a world. And curled beside her, a tiny, purging miracle of ginger fur was the living proof. Sometimes the greatest storms don't take things away. Sometimes, against all odds, they bring gifts, wild, whiskered, and wrapped in a love that defies the fiercest gale. He watched Willow gently bat the overly enthusiastic kitten away from the bowl, her purr a deep, steady anchor in the calm. Home wasn't just a place anymore. It was this: the quiet symphony of survival, the warm weight of trust, and the luminous glow of a love salvaged from the heart of the tempest. Guardian angels, he thought with a smile that reached his soul, sometimes come with fur, green eyes, and a purr that mends the broken places in the world.